Imagine this. You're the King of France. Everything seems under control. You're the grandson of St. Louis, ruler of the largest kingdom in Europe. Your son sits on the throne. Your daughters-in-law are married to princes, and your dynasty seems as immovable as the walls of Notre Dame. Then one evening, in the royal palace, a princess turns to another and hisses, "Your sister is sleeping with a knight. Not just one, in the Tour de Nesle, on the same furs where pigs once rolled." This isn't fiction. It's the beginning of the infamous Tour de Nesle affair, 1314, the most explosive sex scandal in French royal history. 3 wives of royal princes, Marguerite, Blanche, and Jeanne, were accused of adultery. Not the metaphorical kind, the literal one. They allegedly carried on long-standing sexual relationships with 2 knight brothers, Philippe and Gautier d'Aunay, who were later tortured and executed. This wasn't a mere family drama. It was a case where sexual betrayal became a matter of state, and female bodies became battlegrounds of political war. After this scandal, France would lose its direct heir and within decades plunge into the 100 Years' War. But it all began with a petty comment flung between royal daughters-in-law. If you enjoy stories that make HBO look tame, hit that subscribe button and tell us in the comments, where are you listening from? And what time is it there? We'd love to know if you're with us over morning coffee or midnight irony. The story of the royal sluts isn't just one of adultery. It's the unraveling of a dynasty, starting from someone else's bed. Joan of Navarre wasn't just one of the princesses caught up in a royal sex scandal. She was a woman history first crowned as queen, then branded as a criminal, and eventually scrubbed clean, like linens after whispered confessions in a tower. Her fate is unique. Of the 3 accused women, only Joan kept both her title and her head. Joan was the daughter of the King of Navarre and the wife of Philip, son of Philip the Fair, the man who would become King Philip the Tall. Their marriage, like all royal unions of the time, was a political alliance. But Joan had ambition. She had a strong will, a hefty dowry, and growing influence at court, all of which increasingly irritated her father-in-law, the king. In 1314, she, along with her sisters-in-law, Marguerite and Blanche of Burgundy, was accused of adultery. The accusations came from within. Queen Isabella of France, then Queen of England, raised the alarm. Allegedly, she noticed that gifts she had given to her relatives were being worn by 2 men, the knightly brothers d'Aunay. For Isabella, trapped in a humiliating marriage with Edward II, this moment ignited a flame of righteous fury. Philip IV ordered an investigation. Blanche and Marguerite were arrested first, imprisoned, beaten, tortured. The d'Aunay brothers faced even worse. Their bones were broken, their skin flayed, they were suspended by their genitals. Their confessions were bloody and public. Joan, however, was only placed under house arrest, not tortured or executed. Her husband, Philip V, was not yet king, but he wielded political influence, and despite his father's pressure, he refused to disown her. That decision likely saved her life. Yet even if her body was spared, her reputation was violated. Joan spent 2 years imprisoned in the Château de Dourdan. No servants, no comforts, no conviction, and no justice. But when her husband ascended the throne in 1316, Joan returned to court. She became Queen of France once more. History doesn't give us her diary. We don't know what she thought of the man who let her live but did not protect her dignity. What we do know is this: she survived where others were utterly destroyed. Philip IV of France, known as the Fair, had 3 sons and 3 daughters-in-law, all from the powerful House of Burgundy, all officially noble, properly married, producing children, and all 3 would soon be entangled in a scandal so vile it nearly shattered the French crown. Marguerite of Burgundy, wife of Louis, the future Louis VI, Blanche of Burgundy, wife of Charles, the future Charles IV, Joan of Navarre, wife of Philip, the future Philip V. The scandal erupted in 1314, sparked by a single glance and a whisper. Queen Isabella of France, daughter of Philip IV, and by then Queen of England, noticed something strange during a visit to Paris. A belt she had gifted to one of her sisters-in-law was now wrapped around the hips of a knight. This wasn't a fashion coincidence. It was damning. Isabella, raised at the French court, understood. An intimate item on another man meant something was very, very wrong. Philip IV didn't wait for confirmation. He wasn't just a king. He was obsessed with order. His reign was a crusade against the Knights Templar, Jews, Florentine bankers, anyone he saw as disturbing divine or financial harmony. And now, sin in his own house. The Donne brothers, court knights, were arrested first. Their capture marked the start of a brutal inquisition. They were tortured mercilessly. Under agony, they confessed to having 2-year-long sexual affairs with Marguerite and Blanche. Joan was mentioned cautiously, likely because her husband still had political pull. But that didn't shield her completely. All 3 princesses were imprisoned, yet they were held separately. Marguerite was locked away in Chateau Gaillard, where she would later die under grim conditions. Blanche was confined to a convent under constant watch. Joan was sent to the fortress of Dourdan, stripped of comfort but spared from physical torment. They were beaten, their hair cut, their titles stripped, their children declared of questionable paternity, their marriages tainted, their reputations annihilated. This wasn't just a moral purge, it was a crisis of legitimacy, because if the princesses were adulteresses, then their sons might be bastards, and the succession wide open to challenge. And here's the key detail: not a single piece of evidence outside the confessions, extracted under torture, was ever presented. But it was enough to destroy the lives of 3 women and shake the throne to its foundations. Medieval France had a long memory for sin and very little patience for women who broke the rules, especially women who shared their beds with the wrong men. But even more brutal was the way church and crown proved their righteousness. Torture wasn't just punishment. It was public theater, meant to feed the crowd and frighten the rest. The Donne brothers, Philippe and Gautier, were the first to suffer. Seized without trial, they were thrown straight into the hands of executioners. Chroniclers describe how they were beaten with rods, their muscles torn with iron hooks, and their bones crushed on the breaking wheel. Between sessions, their heads were shaved. They were forced to name every woman they'd ever seen smile. Suspended by their genitals, scalding water poured down their throats, they were coerced into signing confessions. Those confessions led to their sentence. They were flayed alive, castrated, and broken on the wheel in the central square of Paris. The crowd applauded. The king watched from a window. One legend even claims the flesh of one brother was thrown to dogs near the gates of the Louvre. The princesses were spared physical torture, but what they endured was a systematic moral destruction. Marguerite was locked in Chateau Gaillard, a cold, damp fortress with mold-covered stone. According to reports, she slept in chains on straw, guarded by former criminals. She was fed scraps, silenced, and beaten with a stick across her teeth when she tried to scream. She lived that way for nearly a year and died. One version says she was strangled by a guard. Another, that she succumbed to pneumonia from the cold cellar floor. Blanche was confined to a convent under God's watch, but this was no mercy. Her hair was cut. She was dressed in coarse sackcloth, forced to kneel for hours in silent prayer, no letters, no visits. Her life became a penitential performance. Joan, though treated slightly better, sat in solitary confinement. She didn't know if execution awaited her. Every day she waited for the knock. Legend says her cell walls bore the scratched marks of past prisoners. Though she was eventually restored to court, the scars remained, invisible but deep. This was not mere punishment. It was spectacle. And in this show, the leading roles were played by bodies. Male torn apart, female humiliated, and the most attentive audience, the state. The Tour de Nesle, a tower on the banks of the Seine, would become infamous not for its battles, but for what happened inside its stone walls after sundown. According to chroniclers, it was here that Marguerite and Blanche held secret trysts with the Donnet brothers for nearly 2 years, regularly, boldly, under the cover of night. Some accounts claim the Donnet brothers received a key to the tower from a servant close to Princess Marguerite. Their meetings took place in the upper chambers, with furs laid out on the floor, wine flowing, sweets and exotic fruits delivered. Music played. Sometimes jugglers were invited. One rumor suggests that courtesans were brought in from pleasure houses to create a more relaxed atmosphere. These were not simple rendezvous. They were acts of bodily defiance, a carnal protest in a court where women were expected to remain silent ornaments of the crown. But who exposed them? History points to Queen Isabella of England, daughter of Philip d'Artois, who during a visit to Paris noticed a richly embroidered belt, one she had gifted to Jeanne, now wrapped around Philippe Donnet's waist. It set off alarms. Isabella, no stranger to the cold, humiliating politics of marriage, began to investigate. Some suggest she witnessed the activity herself. Others believe she received the information from a bribed chambermaid. In any case, after Isabella's report, a covert surveillance operation was launched. Philip the Fortress men monitored servant routes, tracked the princess's movements. Eventually, one night, they were caught, not just 2 by 2, all together. Allegedly, one knight was found nude, another in bed with 2 women, and one princess intoxicated, the other unconscious in a silk nightgown. What's true, what's myth, we may never know. But we do know this: just weeks passed from surveillance to arrest, and there was more than enough to ignite a scandal. The Tour de Nesle became more than a place of betrayal. It became a theater of sexual power, where women tried to reclaim autonomy. at the price of total ruin. Empires sometimes fall to war, sometimes to taxes, and sometimes to one night in a tower, where women were branded criminals and kings turned into paranoiacs. The Tour de Nesle affair was more than a scandal. It shattered trust in the royal family, triggered a dynastic crisis, and ultimately paved the way for the 100 Years' War. After the execution of the Donay brothers and the imprisonment of the princesses, the French throne was exposed. In 1316, Louis VI, husband of Marguerite, died. His only son, John I, lived for just 5 days. Rumors swirled that the child was illegitimate, the product of Marguerite's affair. What followed was a brutal debate over succession. Who had the right to rule? For the first time since Charlemagne, France faced a contested crown. Philip V, husband of Joan, quickly declared himself king. But his rule was shadowed by suspicion, since Joan's reputation was still stained. Though she was restored as queen, doubts lingered. Legitimacy was now fragile. After Philip's death, the crown passed to his brother Charles IV, husband of Blanche. But that marriage was already broken. Blanche was locked away in a convent. They had no children. And when Charles IV died, the Capetian dynasty, which had ruled France for nearly 300 years, collapsed. And then came England. The daughter of Philip IV, Isabella, the very woman who had exposed the royal sluts, was the mother of Edward III, King of England. He had a blood claim to the French throne. The French nobility rejected it, insisting that no woman could transmit royal rights. But Edward did not forget. In 1337, he pressed his claim, and the 100 Years' War began. It would last 116 years. From the wreckage of a few marriages came a descent into national catastrophe. It all started with scandal, but that scandal rotted the state from within. Like a worm that first spoils the fruit, then the tree. The Tour de Nesle wasn't just a site of sin. It became a symbol of political decay, where the personal turned into the national and the body into a weapon. Philip IV the Fair never lived to see the full fallout of the scandal he ignited. He died in November 1314, just months after the Donay brothers were executed. And not from guilt, from a stroke during a hunting trip. Chroniclers wrote he was struck down on horseback, collapsing so hard he couldn't speak before his death. Some said coincidence, others karma. Louis VI, his son, didn't last long either. Within a year, sudden death after a game of tennis. After drinking several goblets of cold wine, his stomach gave out. His body bloated, his face turned purple. The doctors called it a chill, but the people whispered, poison, maybe revenge for strangling Marguerite. Her death in prison remains a mystery. Then came death after death. Philip thought, Charles, no heirs, no glory. The dynasty dead. And the women? Blanche died in the convent. Joan outlived them all, but became a shadow, a silent queen who knew too much and said too little. Only one walked away with power, Isabella. The irony? The woman who exposed the royal sluts became the greatest schemer of the English court. She overthrew her husband, King Edward II, installed her son on the throne, and became the mother of the 100 Years' War. All of it born from a story where a woman's body became her sentence. And the most chilling part? None of them ever received an apology. No rehabilitation, no "we were wrong." Even 700 years later, we still call them the royal sluts, not victims of the system. This wasn't a story about debauchery. It was a story about power-wielding sex as a weapon, and how easily an empire falls once you destroy the woman first. Imagine this. You're the Queen of France, married to young King Louis VII, a man with the pious face of a monk and the charisma of a lukewarm sermon. You're Adelaide of Savoy, noble, wealthy, beautiful, and unusually for the 12th century, educated. You've produced an heir. You've done everything by the book. And then one day, your husband publicly declares you an adulteress, claims you've betrayed him with none other than the Bishop of Senlis, Luc de Boissy. Thus begins one of the most scandalous royal dramas of the Middle Ages. And this isn't just a tale of bruised egos, it's a snapshot of a France teetering between spiritual authority and royal power. Bishops waged subtle war against kings. The Pope often outweighed the monarch. And a woman's virtue? That was stronger currency than silver. Thus begins one of the most scandalous royal dramas of the Middle Ages. And this isn't just a tale of bruised egos, it's a snapshot of a France teetering between spiritual authority and royal power. Bishops waged subtle war against kings. The Pope often outweighed the monarch, and a woman's virtue? That was stronger currency than silver. So the king, backed by the church, obliterates his wife's reputation. She is not only unworthy of my bed, he implies, but she has dishonored the throne. And what happens to Adelaide? She is thrown out of court, publicly. Her alleged affair with a high-ranking clergyman becomes royal gossip. And when she tries to protest her innocence, no one listens. In 12th century France, a woman's word meant nothing, especially against a king's, when the church was ready to nod in agreement. Subscribe to our channel if you love deep, slow-burn historical stories. And tell us in the comments, where are you listening from? And what time is it where you are? We'd love to know how far across the world our stories travel. Adelaide's story isn't just a romantic tragedy, it's an indictment of the age. Could a woman preserve her dignity when the very system was designed to break her? To grasp the scandal that engulfed Adelaide of Savoy, we must step back into the chaotic mosaic of the 12th century, a time when marriages weren't unions of hearts, but diplomatic arrangements soaked in dowries, geopolitics, and ecclesiastical gamesmanship. Adelaide was no minor noblewoman. She came from the powerful House of Savoy, one of the most influential dynasties, connected to the imperial circles of the Holy Roman Empire. Her marriage to Louis, the future King of France, was arranged in 1137 with a clear purpose to secure an alliance between the French crown and key Alpine territories. In essence, she was not so much a bride as she was a geopolitical adhesive. Louis VII, for his part, was never meant to be king. That role was destined for his older brother, who died unexpectedly. Raised in a monastery, Louis thought like a monk, steeped in fasting, prayer, and religious fervor. When the crown landed on his head, he entered the whirlwind of royal politics utterly unprepared. At first, the marriage between Adelaide and Louis was cold, but functional. She bore a daughter, Marie, fulfilling her dynastic duty. But for Louis, that wasn't enough. He wanted a son. More than that, he wanted a queen who mirrored his ascetic piety. Adelaide, refined, educated, with deep Roman ties, was far too worldly for his taste. Enter Bishop Luc de Boissy, a close royal advisor, an intellectual, a theologian, and, rumor had it, an overly attentive listener to the Queen's evening conversations. Factions at court, hungry for influence, began to whisper, "There's something going on," and Louis believed them. Then came the formal accusation, public, unsupported by evidence, but backed by the church. In a society where women could be burned for a mere suspicion of sin, Adelaide was doomed. The church, always eager to assert its authority over the monarchy, seized the moment. They sided with the king, reinforcing the message that only meek, God-fearing queens had a place beside the Lord's anointed. Adelaide, politically inconvenient, independent, proud, was a threat. She was expelled. She vanished from court, from chronicles, from her throne, but not from history. Her daughter Marie would go on to play a role in French aristocracy, and Adelaide herself would remain a symbol of how much a woman's dignity could cost in a world ruled by God, but spoken for by men. In the 12th century, marriage was not a sacrament of love. It was a pact between clans, crowns, and bishops. Ironically, the church, which preached marital fidelity, was often the driving force behind dissolving unions. In Adelaide's case, it wasn't witnesses, evidence, or even the king himself who sealed her fate. It was the clergy who saw in her downfall an opportunity for control. Louis VII wasn't the uncontested ruler of France, at least not in practice. The country was far from centralized, and the Pope held a kind of power that modern heads of state could hardly imagine. In the 1140s, the Church wielded not just moral authority, but also political clout. It could annul marriages, excommunicate monarchs, bless wars, or in this case, endorse a royal divorce. Their approach was subtle and surgical. Rather than condemning the king for slander or adultery, the Church reframed the issue as one of an unfruitful union. Adelaide had borne only a daughter, and for a medieval dynasty that spelled near apocalyptic crisis. Then came the ace up the ecclesiastical sleeve, spiritual consanguinity. This legal sleight of hand allowed the Church to annul any marriage on the ground that the couple were related, even distantly, say, in the 7th degree. And if no blood tie could be proven, one could always discover a shared godparent or ancestral link. No scandalous proof against Adelaide was ever presented. But Pope Clement III declared the divorce legitimate. The official wording was pious and politely cruel. The couple were respectable, but their union was incompatible with divine law, a verdict that contained everything except justice. And so, Adelaide lost not just her crown, but her right to be heard. History doesn't even record her reply, not because she was silent, but because no one listened. In an age when men negotiated crusades and crowned emperors, a woman, even a queen, could be removed from the chessboard the moment she disrupted the game. The royal court of the 12th century was no romantic setting of tournaments and feasts. It was a battlefield, not of swords, but of whispers, alliances, and silent executions. In this arena, Adelaide of Savoy, first wife of Louis VII, found herself both queen and target. After giving birth to a daughter, Marie, in 1145, courtiers began murmuring openly, a marriage without a son was a doomed marriage. But it wasn't only about the lack of an heir. Adelaide possessed qualities that unsettled those around her: intellect, political connections, confidence. In an age where a queen was expected to be demure, Adelaide was anything but. Among the most influential figures shaping Louis's view of his wife was Abbot Suger, a towering advisor and architect of the French monarchy's ideology. He envisioned the king as a divine ruler and the queen as a mirror of Christian humility. Adelaide's imperial ties and worldly disposition clashed with that ideal. Another key player was Theobald II of Champagne, a powerful noble and political rival. His family was at odds with the House of Savoy, and undermining Adelaide's position through rumors of adultery would have served his interests well. Allied with clerical factions eager to control royal marriages, the attack became both political and spiritual. And then there was Bernard of Clairvaux, saint, reformer, and spiritual heavyweight. His correspondence shows he supported the idea of annulment when a union failed to meet divine expectations. He didn't need proof of adultery. A lack of harmony was enough. In such a climate, Adelaide's every move was weaponized against her. Her dignity was read as defiance, her silence as guilt, her intelligence as danger. The court, like a finely tuned machine, began to squeeze her out, not through trials, but through the quiet machinery of exclusion. And this is no metaphor. Adelaide was quite literally removed from court, her presence erased, her voice silenced, her place soon filled by figures more agreeable to the king and his clerical handlers. When one royal marriage collapsed, another was already waiting in the wings. In medieval France, a new queen wasn't just a new partner. She was a political signal. The old order was over. A new one had begun. After Adelaide's exile, King Louis VII would marry twice more, and his lineage continued with Philip II Augustus. And decades later, France plunged once again into a scandal centered around the royal bed. Isabella of Hainaut, wife of Philip II, became the target of a smear campaign in the 1190s. She was accused of being the daughter of an actress, a term that, in medieval parlance, had nothing to do with theater as art. It implied moral impurity, promiscuity, and social disgrace. This stain on Isabel's background cast doubt not only on her own virtue, but on the legitimacy of her children, most notably the future King Louis VIII. The accusations were spearheaded by Gautier de Châtillon, Walter of Châtillon, a court poet and cleric. In one of his Latin epics, he insinuated that Isabel's mother lacked proper piety. At the same time, rival noble factions, particularly those aligned with the Duchy of Lorraine, eagerly amplified the rumors to undermine the House of Hainaut. Monastic chroniclers joined the chorus, led by William of Newburgh, who included the gossip in his writings. This is a textbook example of how politically motivated slander could become historical fact when inked by an ecclesiastical pen. But this time, the scandal didn't spiral out of control. King Philip II Augustus, unlike his father Louis VII, stood firmly by his wife. He not only rejected the accusations, but reportedly banned the dissemination of writings that defamed her name. Some accounts even suggest that Gautier de Châtillon was temporarily removed from court. This episode highlights how easily a woman's reputation could be destroyed, and how rarely anyone stepped in to defend her. In Adelaide's case, silence reigned. In Isabel's, her husband's intervention made the difference between disgrace and survival. In both, the same rule applied. A queen's fate rested not on truth, but on the will of her king. In the modern world, divorce is often a legal process, sometimes painful, sometimes liberating. In the 12th century, it was a political execution. You might not lose your head, but you could lose your place in history. That's what happened to Adelaide of Savoy. Her marriage was annulled not out of love lost, but out of dynastic expediency. And the annulment didn't just remove her title. It branded her in the chronicles as a woman who had failed. After her official separation from Louis VII in 1152, Adelaide vanished from court and, notably, from French historiography. Chroniclers barely mention her again. There are no records of her later life, no attempts at rehabilitation. She was deleted as a political entity. That silence is perhaps the loudest testimony to how efficiently the machinery of historical erasure operated. Louis's divorce from Adelaide was the first of three, a pattern that shaped his legacy as a monarch who wielded marriage like a political tool. After her came Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose union with Louis was meant to bring him the richest lands in Europe. That, too, ended in failure. Then came Adele of Champagne, and only with this third wife did Louis finally produce an heir, the future Philip X Augustus. Thus, Adelaide's dismissal was not just personal tragedy, but part of a broader strategy, women as bargaining chips in the game of power. And a queen's reputation, a resource to be spent or discarded when it no longer served its purpose. It's worth noting that medieval annulments were legally complex. The church required proof of marital impediment, consanguinity, impotence, or other divinely sanctioned grounds. But in practice, the Pope could grant anything if politics called for it. In Louis's case, his participation in the Second Crusade, his tumultuous relationship with Eleanor, and mounting clerical pressure all created a context in which divorcing Adelaide looked less like abandonment and more like a holy necessity, but not for her. For Adelaide, it meant erasure, and for history, it became a cautionary tale that queens could be discarded as easily as treaties, and love had nothing to do with it. In the story of Adelaide of Savoy, there is no final act of mercy, no redemption, no songs sung in her name. She vanishes, a shadow of a woman who once wore a crown, and now not even her portrait survives. And in that silence lies the true tragedy, not because she was unloved, but because she was made guilty of no longer being needed. 12th century France called itself the Kingdom of God, but it operated like a corporation. A queen had a function, reproductive, political, ceremonial. If she failed to meet expectations, she was replaced, like an outdated tool. And Adelaide, with her independence, intellect, and noble power, was dangerous. She irritated the men around her because she refused to play a role. She insisted on being herself. That alone made her guilty. Perhaps the greatest irony of this tale is that nearly every figure who orchestrated her downfall would eventually fade or fail. Louis VII, remembered by contemporaries as pious but weak, is known today largely as the man who lost Eleanor of Aquitaine. The church, which supported his annulment, would go on to lose numerous battles over secular power, and France itself, within a century, would descend into succession crises, fueled by the ambitions of the very heirs of those who once humiliated Adelaide, yet her name endures as a warning. as historical proof that in an age that preached God but operated on fear, to be a woman was to justify your worth daily and still lose, not because of wrongdoing, but because of the system. Because this story isn't fiction, and it isn't Shakespeare. It's a tragedy, documentary in nature, and all the more haunting because it truly happened. Want to know what level of sheer audacity terrified the church in the 12th century? Stay with us. Up next, a story of bloody castration. Picture this. Paris, 12th century. Night falls over the city. Candlelight flickers through the high windows of the Abbey of Sainte-Geneviève. Above, libraries, scribes, and philosophers. Below, blood-soaked sheets. A man once hailed as a rising star of reason has just been castrated in his own bed before witnesses, without trial, without mercy. But it didn't start with sin. It started with a lecture. Pierre Abelard, philosopher, theologian, teacher, was the rock star of the Latin-speaking world. His lectures were sharp, confrontational, heretical to some. He criticized everyone, even Augustine. He challenged church authority, ridiculed universities, dismantled doctrine, and the worst part, he was convincing. Students adored him. Elders feared him. And in that same Paris lived Eloise, 17 years old, the niece of powerful Canon Fulbert. She lived near the abbey, but wasn't some meek little postulant. She was a brilliant intellectual, fluent in Latin, familiar with Greek and Hebrew, and bold enough to quote classical authors even monks whispered about in fear. And yes, she was beautiful. Abelard decided, I will teach her, and Fulbert agreed. A private tutor for his gifted niece, from the most celebrated mind in Paris? Of course. Abelard moved in. His room was next to hers. The lessons began. They lasted hours. From Abelard's own writing, with each session, I became less her teacher and more her lover. Soon, he stopped being a teacher at all. Historians believe the affair lasted over a year. Some say longer. Servants reported kissing in the corridors. Monastic scribes noted that Peter visited chambers he had no business entering. In his Historia Calamitatum, Abelard would later confess, our studies were more about touch than dialectic. This isn't just a tale of forbidden romance. It's a story where love became a crime, and intellect a curse. And yes, it ends with a knife in the bed. Peter Abelard was born around 1079 in Brittany, the son of a minor nobleman. But instead of wielding a sword as expected of a firstborn son, he chose a different weapon, logic, and with it, he launched an intellectual war against the old order. By the time he was 20, Abelard was already dismantling the reputations of France's most respected teachers. At a public disputation with William of Champeaux, then a star theologian in Paris, Abelard exposed contradictions in his teachings in front of a crowd. It wasn't a debate. It was an execution. Students cheered. William was humiliated and enraged. From that day forward, William would become one of Abelard's most bitter enemies, recruiting others to ostracize this arrogant infidel, and the enemies multiplied. Anselm of Laon, a revered theologian, was scandalized by Abelard's critical reading of Scripture, more analysis than reverence. Bernard of Clairvaux, future saint and church bulldog, would later brand Abelard a second Arius, heresy made flesh. Lesser clerics, jealous rivals, and aging professors They all feared what Abelard represented, a mind that made them look obsolete. These men whispered in cathedrals, wrote letters to bishops, compiled watch lists. In lectures, they warned students, beware those who love doubt more than faith. But the youth, they flocked to him. In the 1110s, Abelard opened his own school in Paris, unlicensed, unsupported by church hierarchy, but overflowing with eager minds. Students sat on floors. They scribbled notes on scraps of cloth because parchment was too costly. In the evenings, they repeated his lines in taverns the way people today share tweets. At one point, it became fashionable in Paris to quote Abelard on dates. His method was revolutionary. In his Sic et Non, Abelard placed contradictory quotes from the Bible and church fathers side by side, and then said nothing. He left the contradictions unresolved, an invitation to think, a blasphemy in a time when only scholars were allowed to question, and only in Latin, behind closed doors. And just when he reached his intellectual peak, he met Eloise, and that meeting would begin not only a love story, but a slow-burning revenge, patiently prepared by the men who already wanted his downfall. In the 12th century, a girl who knew Latin was rare. One who could quote Cicero and Aristotle raised eyebrows. But a girl who could argue with you, that was heresy waiting to happen. Eloise was all three. Born around 1100, her origins remain unclear. Some sources suggest noble birth. Others hint at a child born under more scandalous circumstances. What we do know is this. She was raised by her uncle, Canon Fulbert, a rigid, ambitious man with a complicated relationship to the concept of female virtue. Fulbert had a plan. Eloise would be not just beautiful, but brilliant. She was sent to the convent school at Argenteuil, where she quickly surpassed her tutors. By her teens, she was fluent in Latin, could read Greek, and understood philosophical texts most monks struggled with. She didn't want to just recite prayers. She wanted to understand what they meant. And that terrified people. In the letters she wrote, which survive to this day, Eloise reveals a mind sharp as steel and a passion impossible to cage. She was not a victim. She was Abelard's intellectual equal, perhaps even his superior. Years later, writing from her convent cell, she would say, "You sought glory, I sought you. You loved yourself in me, I loved you in yourself." She was too brilliant, too bold, too aware for her time, and that made her dangerous. The church could forgive a repentant sinner, but a woman who thought for herself? Never. When she met Abelard, it wasn't simply love. It was a collision of minds, two intellects recognizing their mirror. They didn't just make love. They debated Seneca and Boethius in bed. They searched for truth in kisses. They wanted to know God through the body. Their bond was physical, intellectual, and fatally dangerous. Because a clever woman who refuses to be silent is dynamite. And in 12th century Paris, there was nothing more dangerous than a literate woman with her own opinion. At first, it was tutoring, then stolen kisses during breaks, then tutoring with kisses. Soon, lessons with Eloise became the worst-kept secret in Paris. They stopped hiding. Abelard continued teaching by day and made love to her by night. in a room granted by her very own uncle. The irony? Fulbert suspected nothing until it was far too late. Servants whispered that they sometimes heard singing and other sounds that clearly weren't prayer. One of Abelard's own students later recalled how the master began skipping passages on chastity. Abelard himself would later write, "Desire overcame my reason. I taught her grammar, but lusted after her as the devil lusts for souls." Then it exploded. Eloise became pregnant. She was underage. She was pregnant in a city of monks. The scandal was biblical. Abelard spirited her out of Paris at night, sending her to Brittany to stay with his sister. There she gave birth to a son, astrolabe, yes, named after the astronomical instrument. Even in motherhood, this couple remained a philosophical provocation. But the scandal didn't end. To protect her honor, Abelard offered marriage, a secret, unannounced wedding. Heloise refused. In later letters, she would explain, "Marriage would destroy your freedom, and I refuse to be your cage." This was not naive love. This was the love of two sharp minds who knew that marriage, in their world, was a trap for thinkers. But under pressure, she relented. The wedding took place at night. No guests, no celebration. And it became just another sin in the eyes of those hungry for blood. When Fulbert found out, he felt betrayed. He didn't want secrecy. He wanted public vindication, a social contract. Instead, he got silence, and so he began to plot. Revenge. Even before the blade would strike, the church was preparing its own inquisition of the mind. And it all began with evenings where a philosopher kissed his pupil under the shadow of Augustine's words. It happened at night, in the heart of Paris. In the modest room Abelard rented, a space that smelled of parchment, wax, and old books. He was sleeping. No guards, no protection. Just the silence of a man who had dared to love out loud. 3 men burst through the door. Servants or hired thugs, sent by Canon Fulbert. No warning, no words. One held a lantern, another a rope, the third a knife. They bound him, pulled away the blanket, and castrated him. They didn't kill, they punished. This was a message written in blood, a physical sentence for a moral betrayal, a public reminder: this is what happens to those who touch what is sacred, the flesh, the mind, and above all, influence. Abelard survived, but he lost everything. His body mutilated, his dignity shattered. In his Historia Calamitatum, he would later write, "I lost not only the ability to love, I lost the right to be a man." And the church? It had been silent before. Now it finally spoke. Not to condemn the attack, but to condemn the scandal. Abelard was forced into a monastery to take vows. His writings were suppressed. Universities turned their backs on him. He was now a liability. And the attackers? Historical sources say that 2 were arrested and blinded by city authorities. But Fulbert himself went unpunished. He was a canon, a man of the church, and the church, as it often does, protects its own. In fact, some within the clergy quietly applauded the act. They called it zealous justice, a defense of moral order. And Heloise, she was shattered. But she did not flee. She did not beg. She entered a convent, not out of guilt, but out of fury. In a later letter to Abelard, she would write, "You took the vows, but I lost more. You still have your voice. I sit in silence because my pain is not worthy of history." This wasn't merely an assault. It was an execution of freedom, of two souls who dared to think and love. And that night remains one of the most terrifying acts of intellectual revenge in European history. After the castration, Abelard became a monk, not out of faith, out of necessity. He entered the Abbey of Saint-Denis, where peace eluded him. Fellow monks watched him with a mix of pity and contempt. Some whispered that he slept on wooden planks, punishing himself for worldly weakness. But the worst wound? Eloise's silence. She vanished, entered the convent at Argenteuil, outwardly a compliant nun, inwardly torn to shreds. Years passed, and then, unexpectedly, the letters began. At first, formal. She asked philosophical questions as if nothing had happened, but her words burned. Have you forgotten our nights? My skin still remembers the sound of your voice. He replied with restraint, like a monk, like a man trying to become an idea. But she broke that illusion. Eloise refused to play the pious role. Her letters became a torrent of pain, memory, and rage. She confessed she didn't want salvation. She wanted him. And she never forgave him for the forced marriage, the convent, the life she never chose. You lost your manhood, but I lost everything else, love, freedom, myself. And then another shadow, their child. Their son Astrolabe grew up without them, left in the care of Abelard's family, likely raised by his sister in Brittany. Historical records suggest he later became a monk and priest, like his father, a life without parents, without warmth, and with a name more suited to a device than a boy. These letters are more than just a love story. They are the first deep portrait in European literature of a woman's grief, unfiltered by moral dogma, not about sin, about human tragedy without redemption. Later, both became abbots, she of the Paraclete, he of St. Gildas. But their letters continued. In one of her final messages, she writes, I do not pray for your salvation. I pray that we may be together again, not in heaven, but in flesh. Time passed. Abelard and Eloise never saw each other again. They wrote and waited. They led monasteries, mentored others, preached humility, all while carrying the memory of a body that no longer belonged to them. Abelard died in 1142, officially, of illness. But some claimed the church broke him. It silenced his teachings, condemned his treatises, and forced him to live without a voice. Eloise outlived him by 20 years. She ensured that his body was reburied at the Abbey of the Paraclete where she lived, and when she died, they laid her beside him in the same tomb. In the 19th century, their remains were moved to Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris, beneath a grand monument surrounded by tourists and flowers. No more condemnation. Now, they were photogenic, but the true legacy is not the grave, it is the letters. For the first time in medieval history, a man and woman engaged in a philosophical dialogue as equals. She was not lesser, not silent. She questioned, contradicted, loved with her mind. They did not agree, they did not reconcile, but they burned together for truth. No blade, no vows. Not even God could divide them. The holiest words, she wrote, were not those we said in church, but what we whispered in the dark. This was not a love story. It was a warning about the price of freedom, about how those who think and love honestly become acceptable only after death. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to our channel and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're listening from. We'd love to know.